Roger Ebert's celebrity comes mainly from his tenure as a television personality. Most people, even nearly 2 decades after his co-host's death, know him as the other half of Siskel and Ebert, and that's how he'll be most remembered decades from now. And while I'm sure a lot of his viewers realized academically he was a journalist first and a TV talking head second, after all, he always introduced himself on At the Movies as Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times, I don't think he's thought of as primarily a writer outside of his newspaper and blog audience who actually took the time to sit down and read his reviews. Ebert wasn't a natural in front of the camera, a fact he discusses in detail in his memoir, and what I appreciate most reading this is getting to know the man in his own element. I love the Life Itself documentary, which watches partly as an adaptation of this memoir, but I'm glad I read this because they serve somewhat different purposes. The movie follows Ebert in his final days and intercuts those moments with a linear history of his life and career up to that point. We hear plenty of Ebert's distinct written voice throughout the documentary, and it is also very much about Ebert the writer. Much of that prose comes directly from this book. But it's a movie that knows it's a movie rather than one that wants to be a memoir, and so its focus is different. This isn't a case of a book being better than the movie. Sure, there's a lot more information in this 400-page memoir than there possibly can be in a 2-hour documentary, and I get to spend a lot more time with Ebert discussing myriad subjects that don't make their way into the film. But film is a different medium, and there's plenty I can glean from the movie that can't possibly be expressed in text. Roger Ebert is unique in that arguably film and prose were equally important to him, or at least film became that way the longer he immersed himself in it. I think the tagline for the documentary may have always been true, at least to some degree. Life itself, the only thing Roger loved more than movies. In his book, Ebert talks about the impact movies had on him growing up, and he clearly developed a passion for film before he ever imagined being tapped by the Sun-Times as its film critic. And despite not aspiring to be a critic before the assignment was handed to him, arguably Ebert loved writing and reporting as much or more than movies, but what I learned reading this book is that Ebert was most alive while he was writing. He all but says that, but that fact is dripping off each page in his effortlessly refined style, his candor, and his imagery. For Ebert, life itself is synonymous with writing. That's not to say he lives vicariously through the words he puts on the page. He does plenty of living outside of his writing all throughout his life. He describes his frequent explorations of London on foot, and he fancied himself a ladies' man, even as he admits his own mistakes in that area early in life. As Ben Sisko says in the Deep Space Nine episode The Visitor, it's life, you'll miss it if you don't open your eyes. I think Ebert would have agreed with that statement, but he had a passion for writing. It was his element, and I don't think he felt more alive than while he was doing it. That's certainly the attitude that shines through in the writing itself, and I think that became a great deal more true at the end of his life, when he had lost his lower jaw to cancer surgeries and could no longer speak. He says that he lost his ability to talk, but that he didn't lose his voice, and once he came to accept his situation, he found the silver lining in it. Being forced to communicate almost exclusively in writing gave him greater confidence in his preferred method of communication. The documentary, while frequently showcasing Ebert's unique personality and voice, is ultimately the work of another artist, and an interpretation, albeit I think a pretty accurate one, of the man through someone else's eyes. I'm glad we have both, a movie about a man who loved and reviewed movies, and also a book written by a man who loved writing. Besides the autobiographical portions, the movie is somewhat akin to documentaries about rock stars, especially the ones in which the star himself participates in the movie's creation. The book is like listening to the rock star's concept album all about his life. At the risk of overselling the book or sounding hyperbolic, Life itself is Ebert's masterwork. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll read it and think it's a masterpiece. It's his personal opus. It's the culmination of his life experiences, but also of all of his writing. It's his self-portrait. It's his DNA in print. In the medium where he's most at home, Ebert paints a detailed and uncensored picture of himself, who he was, who he is, and how he feels. As much as such a thing is possible, when you're holding this book, you're holding Roger Ebert himself. He puts it all in there, but not just the facts, himself. It's the closest a writer can come to putting his brain in a jar or copying his consciousness onto a hard drive. It took me the entire book to realize how great an achievement it is, because it wasn't quite what I was expecting or what I wanted from a Roger Ebert tell-all book. There's a lot more here about Ebert's love of traveling, his passion for journalism, and his friendships and acquaintances with people who had a deep impact on him than there is about the movies he reviewed and the TV show he made. Gene Siskel is mentioned here and there throughout, because he and Ebert were business partners, of course, and spent a lot of time together, and Ebert's recollections about how he thought about things or just his personal connection to a subject Ebert's discussing discussing might be relevant, but Ebert doesn't put a magnifying glass on their relationship until chapter 41, 312 pages into his 415-page book, which was surprising. There are a lot of interesting and amusing anecdotes and insights about the world of Hollywood, naturally, as several of the subjects for Ebert's chapters are filmmakers like Martin Scorsese and Ingmar Bergman, and I appreciate his discussion on the tightrope he walks between getting to know directors personally and remaining as critical of their work as he is of anyone else's. But it's not a book all about films or film criticism, and he talks about a variety of subjects I'd never think to read a whole book about, but which I found interesting because altogether they complete a picture of the man. The documentary lingers longer on the things I came to this book for, but Ebert didn't set out to just give an audience the juicy stuff, and in fact, he squelches some rumors people thought were the juiciest parts of his life, like his supposed love affair with Oprah Winfrey. He set out to put himself and his life on the page, and he does that masterfully. It's self-indulgent in the best way possible. He writes about things that, at one time, would have only seemed significant or interesting to him, but he has such a natural command of language, he can transport me to any point in his lifetime, and I feel like I'm looking at everything from his perspective. I care because he cares. He uses the same conversational, sometimes quippy style he uses in his reviews. He reads like someone who writes the same way he speaks, or the way he once spoke, and no matter what he's talking about, it's never a chore. I almost want to call some of it stream of consciousness, but it's not disorganized, just in the moment, which sounds like the same thing, except Ebert is such a practiced writer, he doesn't need to know where he's going while he's throwing whatever comes to mind on the page. At times, it reads like that's got to be what he's doing, but he organizes his thoughts so automatically, it's never hard to follow or reads like word vomit. One of the sections that most sticks with me is toward the end, when Ebert discusses his inability to eat and what he misses and doesn't miss about that. He says he doesn't miss eating especially, despite his intense love for food and the passionate way he describes taste. His description for eating at Steak and Shake, practically a religious ritual where he grew up, is one of the single most vivid pieces of prose I've ever read. But he does miss the conversation, saying that a lot more of the discourse we have with each other takes place at the dinner table than he had ever considered before he had no other reason to sit there. He says he's mostly given up on talking in a group because in communicating primarily in text, he just can't keep up with the natural progression of conversation. He then says he writes wherever he is and appreciates the time he saves and the freedom he has to put whatever comes to mind on paper. And then he reveals that he and his wife are out on a dinner engagement as he's writing the very passage I'm reading. I feel as though I'm presently observing a moment in the man's life as he's immortalizing the moments of his life that matter to him in writing. I'm sure some revision took place, but it reads like a first draft that doesn't require a second. I haven't read a lot of books like this, and I found myself trying to suss out the difference between an autobiography and a memoir. Based on this and other straight-up autobiographies I've read, it seems to be maybe a matter of history versus memory. Obviously, an autobiography spells out a history from memory, but Roger Ebert's book doesn't take me through his life step by step chronologically, it jumps around. Sometimes I find it a little tedious to keep placing myself back in periods of his life we've already gone over, but this allows Ebert to concentrate on specific aspects of his life and relationships he's had, rather than constantly picking back up on threads throughout a linear timeline that might be difficult to keep track of or stay invested in. That might just be his own choice and structure, but it's not storytelling per se. He tells a lot of stories, but he's not crafting his life story like that of a protagonist going through a character arc in first-person POV. Although he's certainly a man who's had numerous opportunities to change, has taken them, and has grown from those experiences. There are a lot of character arcs one could pick out of this and craft good stories from, but the book is about the whole of his existence and the identity of the man toward the end of his life. It's not a screenplay with a neat beginning, middle, and end. Ebert is choosing subjects that are significant to him and re-experiencing every moment that comes to him related to it. If I had to point to a singular theme in one word, I'd say this is a book about memory. Ebert is really preoccupied with that throughout. He's fascinated by how he remembers, by moments he thought were lost to him forever, by the sensations and activities that trigger them. The more he writes about the things that have happened to him, the more those moments seem to come to him, and in more detail. I find myself a little jealous of the level of detail he's able to describe the past, and then he convinces me that, barring dementia or some other unfortunate condition, it's probably all still in there. He's at his most relaxed and self-assured when he's writing for himself, and that allows him to recall so much more than he could in any other situation. He waxes existential when he talks about memory. He feels as though he exists in every moment he's experienced simultaneously as he's writing. He lives in the past and the present at the same time, and that brings him a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. He's not in denial about the present. He's not escaping into the past. He's reliving those moments to inform the person he is now. Ebert draws himself as a complex and flawed individual. He says he's leaving nothing out, including things he regrets, because if he did, he wouldn't learn anything, and neither would we. He isn't self-deprecating, he just isn't interested in trying to save face, figuratively and literally. He talks about the way he looks at the time of the writing, and that he's glad he let Esquire publish a picture of him. It's what he looks like, it's him, and there's no reason to hide it. He no longer had a jaw at that time, he made peace with it, and he came to understand himself better than he ever had once he had no voice but his pen and his keyboard. Ebert talks about his alcoholism and how he overcame it. He talks candidly about his difficulties with women. He talks about his brashness and unbridled arrogance as a young newspaperman. He talks about how awkward he was when he first got in front of a camera, and how useless he and everyone else seemed to think he was as a TV reviewer without a partner. He talks about disagreements with his mother about relationships, and how he wishes he had said the things that needed to be said while she was alive, rather than going his own way and avoiding the subject. He reads as sincere and genuine on every page because of the risks he takes in the writing. He's thought-provoking, and there's a lot of wisdom here, but he's not some saint who has everything figured out in his old age, and he makes that very clear, sometimes coming right out and saying there's no point to something he writes down. Some thoughts are worth sharing, even if you aren't sure what the ultimate conclusion you might draw from them is. And, like all of us, he contradicts himself. He discusses spirituality toward the end, and says he's more comfortable now with questions than he is with answers, on the subjects of God and why we're here and such. He refuses to call himself an atheist or even an agnostic because he doesn't feel one way or another. He simply doesn't think he can know. But the main reason is his disdain for neat, easy classifications. He doesn't want to be labeled. Yet throughout the book, he frequently and maybe even proudly labels himself a liberal. He brings up specific issues and his opinions on them. He has his own perspective on everything. But it's interesting to me that he doesn't mind a political label, but he's uncomfortable with a religious one. What resonated most with me in this book is its comments on writing and its impact for Ebert on how he sees the world and the power it has in helping him to understand himself and live a meaningful life. There's some great practical stuff here on writing as well, and though Ebert didn't write fiction beyond the Valley of the Dolls, and yes, there's a chapter on that, what he has to say about the writing life is as useful to fiction writers as it is to journalists. He comments on how prolific he is and says he never missed a deadline. He says people assume he's fast, but he says he isn't. He just spends less time not writing. That's as good of writing advice as I've read, and this isn't even a writing book. If you're a film buff, you should read this book for Ebert's take on major filmmakers, and maybe for the chapter on John Wayne alone. I didn't get as much out of some of those chapters as I might have if I was more well-versed in film history, or if I was Jackson Rasco, and I lost some interest, I have to say, by the middle of the book, when it was several chapters in a row of Ebert characterizing people I had heard of, but didn't know enough about for those sections to stay with me. There's only so much context a writer can give you about a historically important figure before it feels like hand-holding. He draws distinct and rich characters as far as he knows them, but I know if I was more familiar with some of their movies, his take on them would be a richer experience for me. Ebert puts me in his head as much as he can, but he can't put the movies in the book, and so I sometimes feel like there's some required viewing I need to fully appreciate stories and anecdotes. I've always admired Roger Ebert, but now I feel like I've gotten to know him. His memoir is raw, thought-provoking, and inspiring. Even if you've watched a lot of Siskel and Ebert, I think you have to experience him in his natural habitat, creative nonfiction, to truly get him. Beyond people who just admire the man, I recommend this book to anyone interested in the writing craft, in film history, and in 20th century pop culture. Like Stephen King's On Writing, it's a book I'm almost sure to revisit, not just for what it has to say about writing and the life of a man who devotes his life to the craft, but for the infectious quality of the writing, which seems almost imbued with the spirit of the man who wrote it.